Thank you, everybody. So this afternoon, we are going to go through a presentation by Spencer Talmadge from NOAA Fisheries in their Garfo office on the draft action plan that was released to reduce the Atlantic sturgeon bycatch in federal large mesh gillnet fisheries. But before we do this, on my right, James Boyle, who is one of our newer FMP coordinators. He wasn't able to make it to the May meeting, so I just wanted to introduce him in person in the flesh to the commissioners. We're super excited to have James on board, and he's been running headfirst with Menhaden and been doing a wonderful job, and we're just excited to have him here and just let you know who he is and what he looks like. For today, Spencer's going to go through the action plan. And once he's done and we've asked questions, I ask of the group is to think about whether or not we want to make comments to NOAA Fisheries on the action plan. If we do, if we could get some ideas of what those comments are this afternoon, then James and I can present those comments to the policy board tomorrow if we want to approve sending comments to NOAA Fisheries. So Spencer, I think we will hand it off to you, and Maya, if you could put his presentation up, that would be great. And Spencer, if you could just let Maya know when it's time to turn to the next slide, she would greatly appreciate it.
Sure, thank you. You can hear me, right?
Hear you great, thank you.
Awesome. As was said, my name is Spencer Talmadge from the Sustainable Fishery Division at Garfo. I'm going to be giving a presentation on the Atlantic Sturgeon Bycatch Working Group and its action plan to reduce bycatch of Atlantic sturgeon in federal large mesh gillnet fisheries. And so this is obviously the first time that you folks have been given this presentation. I have delivered this both to the New England and Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Councils. So if there are any folks in the audience that were at any of those meetings, this might be a little different from what you saw there, just because covering a little more ground. And so next slide, please. And so just to give a quick introduction, again, you folks haven't gotten this presentation yet before, so just to get some background in. On May 27th of 2021, NOAA Fisheries released a Section 7 biological opinion on 8 federal fishery management plans and 2 interstate fishery management plans, looking at the impact of those on ESA listed species and designated critical habitat. And so as part of the terms and conditions of the biological opinion, NOAA Fisheries was required to convene a working group to do a couple different things. The first was to conduct a review of available information pertaining to Atlantic sturgeon bycatch in the federal large mesh gillnet fisheries, defined here as, in this context, as equal to or greater than 7 inches. We were also required to produce an action plan by May 27th, which would reduce that bycatch by 2024. And the action plan had to include an evaluation of post-release mortality, including identification of needed information and a plan timeline for acquiring and using this information. Next slide, please. And so the Atlantic Sturgeon Bycatch Working Group was formed in order to meet these requirements. The first full meeting of the group did not occur until February 14th, 2022. Part of that was some wrangling around with something called the Federal Advisory Committee Act. That prevented us from, the group was made up of NOAA Fisheries employees, both from Garfo and the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, and state fisheries agency staff. And so figuring out formation of the group kind of delayed us until February of this year. And so the group met and completed its work and released an action plan online as a draft on May 26th of this year, a whole day ahead of our deadline. And so we released that as a draft because obviously the working group and its makeup did not include council staff, did not include commission staff. And so we wanted to provide an opportunity to incorporate feedback from the councils, commission, and general public into the action plan. And the plan for the plan is to produce the finalized version of it in September. Next slide, please. And so just quickly, I'm not going to read off all these names, but these are all the folks that were involved. Obviously, you can see folks from New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maine, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Obviously, I want to thank these folks for their hard work. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to give an overview of the action plan and what we're going to walk through. First off, what does the action plan do? So it communicates the results of the review of the available information regarding Atlantic sturgeon bycatch in our federal gillnet fisheries and highlights the information gaps where we need more information. It also describes regulatory measures that the Atlantic sturgeon bycatch working group recommends the New England and Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Councils consider in order to reduce bycatch in our federal fisheries by 2024. And it establishes a time frame for the development of these measures and further evaluation of post-release mortality. And so again, you'll note that I keep saying the word federal. This is something that applies to the recommendations in the plan are intended to apply to federal largemouth gillnet fisheries. I just want folks to keep that in mind. It also, again, it's recommending things that the New England and Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Councils can consider. Does not mean that, I think that we don't want to overinterpret. Doesn't mean that these are stringent recommendations that must be followed or things that we absolutely have to do. It's more of a, here are some options to reduce bycatch. Let's work through these collaboratively and get something in place that can reduce bycatch by 2024. So in the plan, there is a quick description of the fisheries that we're talking about, just to make sure everybody's on the same page. There is the review of the information that we had. There are actionable conclusions that we drew from that review. So from this information, do we have, what do we know? There are the descriptions of the actual actions that the working group is recommending to reduce Atlantic sturgeon bycatch. And then there's some timelines that we'll get to and we'll talk about. Next slide, please. So yeah, just really briefly, description of the fisheries involved. So the 2021 biological opinion considered 10 FMPs, well, 8 FMPs and 2 IS FMPs. So this is a list of them. Obviously, we expect that any recommendations pertaining to large mesh gill netting would affect the fisheries that primarily function through large mesh gill netting. So American lobster was technically included in the biological opinion, for example, but we don't really expect anything coming out of here to affect that fishery. But just so we know where we're starting from, this is what was in the biological opinion, all that we looked at. And in the action plan, you can see, you can go through a description of each of these and read how the working group said, oh yeah, this fishery does or does not use gill net, so it would or would not be under consideration in this action plan. Next slide, please. So next section here is the information review. So the information that the working group reviewed includes several peer-reviewed scientific papers, available data that we have from the Northeast Fisheries Observer Program database, several grant program reports, particularly for things like gear modifications, workshop reports, a Northeast Fisheries Science Center model-derived estimate of Atlantic sturgeon bycatch, and the 2017 ASMFC stock assessment for Atlantic sturgeon. So these sources looked at things like distribution and occurrence of sturgeon. They analyzed bycatch information, and they looked at things like bycatch mitigation, gear modification, things like that. And so those sources represent the known information available to the working group. And for folks who are interested, a full literature cited section is in that draft action plan. So folks can look at what we looked at. Next slide, please. So based on the review that we did of all those sources, the working group came up with several conclusions based on its review. So I'm going to quickly go through them. First is that the federal gillnet fisheries targeting monkfish, spiny dogfish, and northeast multi-species with sink gillnet gear ranging from 5.5 and 12 inches in minimum mesh size, the primary contributors to Atlantic sturgeon bycatch. I want to really quickly note with that bullet there, I gave this presentation, the exact language of that bullet is slightly different from what's in the draft action plan because gave this presentation at the New England Council and there was a little bit of confusion about what it was saying. And so I've revised it here to try to make it make more sense. And so if you've read the draft action plan, the language is slightly different, but that's meant to be a clarifying thing. Moving on though, second bullet, low profile gill net designs with a reduced net height, shorter tie down length, and a shorter tie down spacing, reduce Atlantic sturgeon bycatch, potentially without reduction in catch of target species. Soak time, next one. Soak time is a likely driver of Atlantic sturgeon bycatch rates and mortality based on available research and just kind of simple concept that like time spent by fishing gear in the water is going to strongly correlate with the chances that the gear interacts with sturgeon. So the more that's in the water, more likely a sturgeon's going to interact with it. And also, the longer the gear is in the water, if it does interact with the sturgeon, the longer that sturgeon is sitting there underwater and caught in that gear, the more likely that the mortality is to occur. And I will also note, again, give this presentation to the New England Mid. There were some questions about soak time, and in the final version, we're looking we're doing a little bit more. There's going to be more in the final action plan about soak time than there currently is in the draft version. And maybe I'll get to that, but next slide, please. So available research indicates that temperature and depth are primary drivers of sturgeon movement and abundance. I think this is pretty well understood that sturgeon tend to occur in shallower waters and especially during seasonal coastal movements from marine to river estuaries in the spring and from river estuaries to marine waters in the fall. And so I think the particular point about this one is that migratory pathways along the coast used by many sturgeon represent key areas of high abundance. So you would want to focus on those areas when you're devising any sort of measures to protect sturgeon. And then finally, post-release mortality for Atlantic sturgeon is not well understood. We only have a small amount of information on the topic, and the research that we do exist has pretty small sample size. In particular, there was a tagging study that looked at tagged caught sturgeon, and if I'm recalling right, it only had about 10 or 12 samples, and then some of them, not every sample produced information that was usable, and things like that. So we don't know a lot, and we need to do more to understand post-release mortality. Next slide, please. So from those conclusions, in the action plan, the working group recommended 3 primary approaches to achieve bycatch reductions in federal large mesh gillnet fisheries by 2024. These are modifications to gear, modifications to fishing practices, and consideration of areas of focus in regions where Atlantic sturgeon bycatch is the most common. And so I'm going to go through these recommendations, but I think one thing that needs to be said beforehand is that the approaches and the more specific recommendations that are in the action plan are not intended to be mutually exclusive. They're intended to be sort of, some combination of these could be implemented to balance desired bycatch reduction with the needs of affected fisheries. So in plain language, the intention here is to be able to mix and match, recommendations that are coming out of the action plan, that the councils are able to mix and match recommendations to kind of figure out what measures work best to reduce bycatch, but also allow the affected fisheries to still efficiently operate. And so that can, there are many options for how you do that, and we wanted to provide options for the councils. Next slide, please. So the first approach is modifications to gear. And so primarily the working group recommended that the councils consider requiring the use of low profile gillnet gear by federally permitted vessels while fishing under a monkfish day at sea, participating in a large mesh exemption area with a minimum mesh size of 10 inches, or more, or fishing under a Northeast multi-species day at sea in the large mesh day at sea program. And so the working group considered that a low-profile gill net design has a mesh size ranging from 12 to 13 inches, a net height ranging from 6 to 8 meshes tall, a tie-down length of 24 inches, tie-down spacing of 12 feet, and a primary hanging ratio of 0.50. Next slide, please. So in particular, the working group highlighted a net that was used by Fox et al. In 2019 that had used in a gear modification study for sturgeon bycatch mitigation. That had a 13-inch mesh size, a net height of 8 meshes, 12-inch tie-down length, 12-foot tie-down spacing. Those nets were 300 feet long. Strings were 8 to 12 panels, totaling 2,400 to 3,600 feet long. And so the working group noted for this net that there were two vessels that were participating in the study. There was a New Jersey-based vessel and a New York-based vessel. The New Jersey-based vessel, the comparisons between the low-profile net and the standard gill net design showed no significant reduction of target species, in this case monkfish, catch for that New Jersey-based vessel. Both of these vessels were also targeting skate. Neither of them showed a significant reduction of skate catch. However, for the New York-based vessel, there was, and when I say significant, I mean scientifically significant reduction in monkfish catch between the low profile and the standard gill net design. My understanding is that for this particular study, the New York vessel was experiencing generally high monkfish catch rates, so that more monkfish were available in the area that it was fishing in, and it used a longer soak time than the New Jersey-based vessel. And so my understanding of what the reason behind this is perhaps that the amount of monkfish that were in the net in combination with the amount of time that was in the water may have contributed to the net not performing as effectively as the standard net that has the larger tie downs and the larger tie down spacing. And so I think what this shows and what the working group has highlighted is that continued experimentation. There's clearly a need for continued experimentation to achieve the right gear configuration, the right fishing practices with a low profile gill net design to continue to use that gear to effectively fish. But it did note that that need has to be balanced with the need to implement meaningful bycatch reductions as soon as possible for Atlantic sturgeon. Next slide, please. So moving on to modification to fishing practices, the working group recommends that the councils consider measures to reduce soak time of gill nets deployed by federally permitted fishing vessels. Same deal under monkfish day at sea, large mesh exemption area, large mesh day at sea program. Again, when you looking at the conclusions from the literature review, soak time was heavily related to sturgeon bycatch, longer time years in the water. So it was a potential measure to reduce that bycatch would be to limit or to reduce the total amount of soak time of gill nets deployed on a federally permitted fishing vessel. It's worth noting that soak time in the federal large mesh gill net fisheries vary greatly across relevant fisheries due to regional differences in fishing practices and conditions. So what that means is when you look at, and this is something that's going to be not currently elaborated on heavily in the action plan, but it's something that I think we're working to get into the final version, is that when you look at things like, for example, the mean and median soak times for monkfish gear, those soak times are in comparison to vessels that are targeting spiny dogfish. The soak times for spiny dogfish fishery are typically shorter than that of the monkfish fishery. And so when you're looking at reducing soak time, you need to make sure that you're reducing soak time in a fishery that maybe has more soak time than others. So you want to make sure that you target that measure to better address where soak time is long and poses a greater risk to Atlantic sturgeon. It's worth noting, and the working group notes this as well, that measures to reduce soak times could be potentially challenging. It's hard. It can be difficult to enforce. The agency has explored the development of data loggers, which could be used for soak time enforcement, but there are likely regulatory changes which do not require the use of loggers that can effectively reduce soak time. So things like improving efficiency in the fishery, so people don't have to have their gear out for as long as they are, or eliminating certain things that allow people to vessels to leave their gear out in the water for longer, like certain programs, might be things that can be explored. Next slide, please. And so finally, I've kind of termed these areas of focus, the areas where available observer data suggests high incidence of Atlantic sturgeon bycatch and gillnet fisheries. So there are a couple of different distinct regions along the Atlantic coast, which roughly correspond to available examples from the literature review that suggest where Atlantic sturgeon bycatch might be the most frequent. Looking at the map to the right, this is a heat map of, available observer data. So these are observed gillnet hauls. And so on the bottom, you have a heat map of every single gillnet haul in the NEFAP observer database, I think from 1989. And then on the top, you have mapped is a heat map of the observed hauls which caught an Atlantic sturgeon. And so you'll see that, next slide, please, sorry. You'll see that the Gulf, so these squares represent different areas of focus that are in the action plan. And so you have, from the top, you have a Gulf of Maine area, you have a Cox's Ledge, Rhode Island, Martha's Vineyard area. Moving down, you have a New Jersey, that's the New Jersey area. And then there are two boxes there. There should be a third along the Delmarva and Peninsula and the southeast coast of Virginia. And so the action plan highlights each of these areas and notes that if we were going to put measures in place to do things like restrict fishing entirely, or for the federal fleet, or implement gear regulations, or if you wanted to put soak time regulations in place, these are the places that we expect these measures to be most effective. And so the working group recommended that the councils consider these areas for small, focused, and potentially seasonal measures. Obviously, all this information is gathered from the observer database, and so it's going to be strongly related to fishing effort. You only get observer data where people are fishing because observers are on fishing boats. Initially, the working group considered, but ultimately discarded, like broad area-based measures. So these boxes, maybe closing them entirely, but we discarded that because obviously that would have a high negative impact to the fisheries involved. Further work on this is needed to evaluate some trade-offs and potential impacts. I think the council process, if they take this up. I do want to note really quickly for each area. So the Gulf of Maine area at top here seems the most intrinsically tied to fishing activity, which occurs around, it's called the Western Gulf of Maine closed area, and just fishing in general on Stillwagon Bank. We did identify a lot of the seasonal trends that were present in the literature. So in the observer database, we saw that most sturgeon interactions occurred in the late fall and spring, which is something that was, most of the literature seemed to agree with. This activity was closer inshore during the spring and farther out in the colder months. Again, something similar to what the literature showed. And then part of the part of the work that we're doing over the summer, heading to the final plan, you know, in the draft action plan as it is, we're only really seeing with the draft action plan only really doesn't really identify what fisheries are interacting with sturgeon where. It's just these are all gillnet hulls, and so what we're trying, I think what we'll try to do for the final, is doing a better job of identifying, you know, which fisheries are working where. I think it would be pretty. My understanding is that, for example, a lot of dogfish fishing is occurring farther south. A lot of monkfish fishing is occurring north. The action plan currently doesn't clearly state that. So, trying to make that more clear in the document, because that was something that folks were asking for, and we expect that to add more context to assist the fishery management councils with some of their decision making. Next slide, please. Next slide. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Sometimes there's a delay.
Okay.
So you can just keep.
Oh, that's fine. Yep. I just wanted to, I heard a weird beep at some point, so wanted to make sure. Okay, quickly moving on to post-release mortality. Like I mentioned, our understanding of post-release mortality of Atlantic sturgeon captured in gillnet gear is pretty poor. The only really available information is a tagging study hampered by a small sample size. So the working group recommended that the councils, ASMFC, and NOAA Fisheries prioritize focused research in two subordinate categories. The first of these is coming up with quantitative estimates of post-release mortality rates, and then the second one is injury assessment for entangled sturgeon. To inform the development of these recommendations, the working group looked at the workshop style approach that was used to develop technical guidelines for assessing injury of sea turtles, which began in 2003. So just as a simple summary of that, you know, the agency conducted an initial assessment of the magnitude of injuries for sea turtle interactions with Atlantic sea scallop dredge gear via the issuance of a detailed questionnaire that was sent to various experts in sea turtle veterinary medicine and rehabilitation. So we sent out a questionnaire about sea turtle injury. Use the results of that questionnaire to generate working guidance for observers working on scallop gear to better understand sea turtles which were being captured, what are their likelihood of survival, and then to extend those guidelines to understanding sea turtle mortality and other fishing gear. A workshop was held and technical guidelines were produced. And so essentially that helped us better understand, you know, the amount of mortality that was occurring for sea turtles. And so the working group looked at, like, could we replicate this process for sturgeon? And so the answer there, I think, so with the working group kind of realized that the network of one of the keys to the success of the sea turtle example was that there was a really well-developed network of veterinary and rehab experts for sea turtles, which we don't quite have to the same degree for sturgeon. So I think difficult to, you know, use that as a one-to-one perfect template. And so instead, next slide. The working group recommended a two-phased approach with 3 objectives. And those 3 objectives are: 1, develop protocols and criteria for the rapid visual assessment of live Atlantic sturgeon captured in gillnet gear and the estimation of post-release mortality. 2, facilitate information gathering of new data that quantifies post-release mortality of sturgeon caught in gillnet gear. And 3, explore options for assistant science for gillnet fishermen to facilitate long-term assessments of post-release mortality. And so the way that all this would be achieved in the two-phase process, the first phase would be led by NOAA Fisheries, simply to identify all of the steps that we need to take to actually carry out these objectives and to acquire the additional information that we need to inform post-release mortality. So that would be things like outreach to develop a network of researchers and other subject matter experts regarding Atlantic sturgeon biology and related fields, scoping within that network to identify research needs, identification of funding sources, things like that. And so the second phase, once we've done all that work to identify what we need to do to meet our objectives, the second phase is simply for NOAA Fisheries, in collaboration with partners, the councils and commission, where necessary and possible, to work collaboratively to carry all of those steps that were identified in the previous phase. So basically, here's what we're going to do, here's what we're going to do, and then work with our partners to get those things done. And then ultimately, we would produce technical guidelines for observers, which would have those protocols and criteria for rapid visual assessment of sturgeon status in gillnet gear and the other objectives here. Next slide, please. And so this is the timelines that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that are in the action plan. We are here at the ASMFC summer meeting. And so after this presentation is done, as Tony mentioned, I'm going to be taking questions at the conclusion of this presentation, perhaps a response from the ASMFC itself, but also be making sure that I keep track of any questions or comments or concerns from folks in the audience today. And then in September, a finalized action plan will be published online, which will hopefully incorporate as much of the feedback that we received as we can. After that action plan is released, the end of September, the New England Council commences its 2023 priority setting process. And then in October 4th through 6th, the MID commences its discussion of its 2023 implementation plan. So in December, both of those councils will decide on its priority setting process and implementation plan process. In those processes, if the New England and MID agree that they need to prioritize taking action to address the recommendations of this action plan to reduce Atlantic sturgeon bycatch in the federal largemouth gillnet fisheries, starting in January, they would, under this timeline, they would begin action development, and then you can follow it through to action development, submission of action, its review and publication, down to getting a final rule published and implemented by May 1st, 2024, which will be the start of many of our gillnet fisheries in federal waters. If the councils decline during their priority setting process, or if the New England declines during its priority setting process and the MID declines during its implementation plan process to take action under this action plan, or respond to the recommendations in the action plan in a way that would reduce Atlantic sturgeon bycatch. If that doesn't happen, then the National Marine Fisheries, if NOAA Fisheries would need to develop action under the Endangered Species Act to do so. And so the right side of this timeline is basically the timeline that we would do for that. Starting in January, again, we would develop a proposed rule outlining measures that we would be proposing. And then we would develop that final rule to implement measures to reduce bycatch by the start of the May 1st, 2024 fishing year for all of our gillnet fisheries. Next slide, please. This is a timeline. It's pretty wordy, so I'm not going to read it, but it is a timeline for actions to address post-release mortality from gillnet gear. This is also in the action plan. Everything I've shared is basically in the action plan. Again, we start with the NOAA identification of the steps needed, and then it works through, once we've identified all the steps we need, the council's commission, GARFO work through those steps to meet our objectives. I will note that at the New England Council meeting, the New England noted that it would like us to better define the role of councils and the commission in some of these actions, particularly things like science. So that's something that we are working on to do to satisfy that concern that the councils themselves don't directly work on research. So we need to better make clear what we'd be asking the commission and the councils to do. Next slide, please. And that's it for me. So like I said, my email is in this slide. I'm ready for questions now. I'll take questions, keep track of them. if folks want to contact me after or after in order to ask questions or provide more comment, my email is located there. People should feel free to do so, and that's all being kept track of, and we will try to address those things as much as we can in the final action plan. But from there, I can ask for questions if folks would like to ask some.
Thanks, Spencer. Let's go with questions for now, and then if we have some time, if we want to make comments, we can do so. Otherwise, maybe have some emails to James and I later today in order to get us to Menhaden. Go ahead, Connor.
Thank you for your presentation, Spencer. I was just curious, it's my understanding that the councils have also inquired about how this work may or may not interact or relate to some of the efforts being conducted by the TRT. It seems like from the action plan, some of the measures may be similar to some of the conversations that are happening as part of the take reduction team process. So could you explain a little bit about that coordination as well as how that may interact with the timelines you proposed?
Sure. So yeah, you're right. That is something that was raised at both the council meetings. I will note that at least one of our working group members is involved in the TRT. We are in communication, so we do know what each other are working on. The other thing to keep in mind here is that once this action plan is complete and released at the end of September, the councils will receive this, and so they'll be able to adjust their measures accordingly. And so we also would note that I think that if you're looking at things like area closures or gear modifications for one or the other, the groups, like I said, are in communication, and things that the Sturgeon that result from the Sturgeon action plan are going to be considered during TRT process and vice versa. So yeah, definitely understand that concern. Communication is occurring. We are keeping track of that, and trying to make sure that we're not doing things that don't make sense.
Great, thank you, Spencer.
Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Spencer, for your presentation. Can we go back to one of the slides that you had that showed gillnet specifications in terms of mesh size, tie downs, and so forth, with the note that in New Jersey it worked pretty well, but in New York it did not?
So that would be page 12, I believe.
We'll get there then if you.
Okay.
Yeah, that slide, right? So this low profile net design showed no significant reduction of monkfish catch in New Jersey by the New Jersey-based vessel. However, significant reduction in monkfish catch by New York. And I think you mentioned either with this slide or maybe it was one of the following slides that there still needs to be some additional research to take place on this. I've got a couple of questions. That's the first one. So is that correct? That you're recommending?
So I think the message here is that we've, like I said, given this presentation a couple times. There have been folks that have said this is not going to work, but there have been folks that have said, oh, this will work. And so I think it's reasonable to recognize that folks might want to might have different ideas about configurations of this gill net design that will work better, and different ideas about how to use this gear most effectively. And so this was just an acknowledgement that there might be a need for a little bit more work to kind of dial this gear type in. But we do know that this low profile gill net design does reduce Atlantic sturgeon bycatch, and so it's just a matter of figuring out exactly the right way of getting it to the point where it's still effectively fishing for its target species. And the Fox et al. Study here does show that that's possible, and it just might depend on things like soak time and fishing conditions and things like that. And so the answer is not that this isn't ready or that there's problems. It's just that we understand that dialing in a fishing gear configuration can be pretty complicated, and that, we understand that desire to make sure that it works the right way for fishermen. But we do still need, based on the biological opinion, we are required to reduce Atlantic sturgeon bycatch in our federal gillnet fisheries by 2024, and this is a possible method to do that.
Thank you. So with your stated desire to make sure that the gear is effective both at reducing sturgeon and not significantly reducing target catch, is there any planned research to take place before this planning gets developed and implemented during 2023? It's a pretty close timeline.
Yeah, I don't know of anything currently being planned. There's nothing currently being planned by I don't know of anything currently being planned on our end. I don't think Henry Milliken is online, but he would be the person to talk to if he's got anything in the hopper in terms of Henry Milliken at the center. Let me see if I can find him.
Spencer, why don't you just connect us with the person that we can ask that question of through James, and we'll connect Emerson to that person in the interest.
That would be perfect. Yep.
Thanks, Emerson. I have David Borden and then Pat Kelleher.
Yep. Thank you. I enjoyed the presentation, Spencer. And I guess my question is kind of a variant of Emerson's question, and I'll just use this as an example. You've got a slide up here. You're varying 4 different elements in the configuration. Which of those elements is actually reducing the bycatch? Is it do we know that? And that begs the second question. Has the working group basically concluded what the elements of an optimal bycatch reduction configuration for large mesh gear is? Because we're going to be in a position here fairly quickly with the timeline you put up, where people, councils, whomever, are going to have to make decisions in short order. I'm just wondering how strong the science is behind this.
Right, and so when we look at there were probably, so 5 studies by Fox, another study by he. So we looked at basically, when we looked at the gear modification studies, and these are all in the action plan, they kind of, you could see the work that is happening was kind of, they were progressively doing comparisons between more and more less and less tall versions of gillnet design. So if at first you can see the research is between a stand-up design and a basic tie down setup, which are both commercially used configurations just for different target species. And obviously it was established pretty quickly that the tie down design had less sturgeon bycatch than the stand-up. And so from there, Fox and the other researchers that have been working on this have kind of tinkered with that, with the net height and the tie down length and the tie down spacing, those 3 things to kind of dial in the most effective configuration. And at this point, this Fox et al. 2019 configuration is the one that showed the greatest degree of success. And so if we had to pick one, and this is why the ASBWG highlighted this in the action plan, if you had to line up all those different gear configurations that were explored, if you had to pick one, this would be the one. Again, is it, we have the New Jersey-based vessel and the New York-based vessel showing some differing results here. So, it would be hard to sit here and say like, oh yes, this is the optimal design.
Okay.
Probably could be some improvement, but this is what we have now. And this is what we have the most success with now. And so, if folks, so yeah.
Okay, so Tony, can I do a follow-up, please?
One more.
Okay, thank you. I'm just curious, did the work group look at the impacts of setovers and what causes longer setovers? And I just voice the opinion. I think if you want to shorten the setovers, then what we really ought to be looking at is the trip limits, because to a large extent, those trip limits cause fishermen to leave gear in the water longer. They go out, they catch their limit of skates out of one panel of nets, and then they go in because they don't want to work through all the skates in the next panel and just throw them over the side because of the trip limit. So that lengthens the number of days that the gear is in the water. So was there any examination of the impact of the trip limits on how that might be used to minimize bycatch?
So there's no, I'm trying to think of what was in the plan. Like I said, we're working on finalizing the plans. So things are in flux a little bit right now. I think when they're in the draft plan, I don't think there's anything explicitly talking about management measures like trip limits, days at sea, and things like that. There is just the note on, I think it was the next slide, page 13. That last bullet about regulatory changes to reduce soak time might be something that is effective, and so ways to improve the efficiency of the industry to make sure they don't have to leave their gear out in the water for that long to do the fishing they need to do kind of speaks to that, but there was no in-depth like dive into something like that.
Okay, thank you.
We have Pat Kelleher and then Eric Reed, and then we're gonna finish with the questions.
Great, thanks, Tony. I'll be brief because Connor touched on the overlap with the right whale issue. But Spencer, do any of the closed areas come into state waters, the proposed closed areas?
So it's worth noting that these are not, so the areas of focus in this action plan are not proposed closed areas. They are, initially they started out like that, and that's why they still kind of look like boxes that, you know, look like they would be closed areas. But what they really are is just, the action plan is just trying to focus the councils in on these particular areas or where we expect bycatch to occur. So if you want to do something, these are the areas that you should probably do it in. And so the way those are drawn, they do extend into state waters, I'm going to guess, in some places, especially particularly the New Jersey one. I will note, though, that, you know, even places where these, where measures like, say, if the council put in a closed area that extended all the way to the coast, if they were designed such that they affect federally permitted vessels, you know, they would affect federally permitted vessels and would not necessarily affect the state vessels that are fishing within them if they happen to go into state waters. If that makes sense.
Thanks, Eric Reed.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So the Mid-Atlantic and New England are working on a joint monkfish plan right now. Part of that is to possibly enhance the use of days at sea to allow for higher landings in order to catch OY. So maybe that'll address some of Mr. Borden's question. But in that plan, it's become evident that the monkfish fishery basically is using 12-inch mesh now. It's not mandatory, but that the plan is considering making 12-inch mesh mandatory. So my question is, what's the difference between 12-inch and 13-inch mesh on sturgeon? Because it would be a shame to enact one mesh size for monkfish and then have to buy all new gear to accommodate a 1-inch difference for sturgeon bycatch. So I don't know if you have that data.
Sure, and I don't know that I can directly answer, you know, 12-inch versus 13. I do know that some of the gillnet configurations in the literature did use 12-inch, so maybe I can go back and look at, you know, what those gear configurations look like. I don't know if those will answer the question or not. I will note that the 12-inch mesh size that is proposed in the current monkfish framework is structured as a baseline minimum mesh size. So for the fishery, it's possible that if the councils wanted to adopt some sort of low profile kill net design requirement, like I said earlier in the presentation, these recommendations are kind of designed to mix and match. So if you wanted to adopt a low profile gill net design requirement to be used in a specific area where we think it's most effective, where it, is required in the areas where Atlantic sturgeon are most likely to be caught, that's not a baseline requirement for the fishery. So some portions of the fishery wouldn't have to necessarily go from 12 to 13 if that was how that happened. So it's not as if the action plan is saying, oh, everybody has to have, the action plan right now is recommending that the council consider, all these vessels to use this. But again, the councils can kind of mix and match and work on kind of defining, kind of using these recommendations to dial in the bycatch reduction that it wants to meet to balance with the needs of the fishery. So it's not necessarily saying that the entire fishery needs to go 13 inches.
Thanks, Spencer. So in the interest of time, to not start the Menhaden board meeting too late, I guess I'd like to get an indication of whether or not we think we want to provide some comments to NOAA on this draft action plan or not. And if we do, if overnight you could email some ideas of those comments to myself or James, and we can discuss those comments at the policy board. We do have time on the agenda for that, but I'm just trying to get an indication if we think we want to have some official comments to NOAA on this or not. Eric Reed.
Can you just make an omnibus comment letter for sea turtles and monkfish and everything else and just get it over with?
You gonna write that comment letter for me?
Well, you might have to edit it out a little bit, but yeah, well, I mean, I don't know, Tony. I personally, I think we should comment. That's the way I see it. I mean, my comment is, what's the difference between 12 and 13, and why are we imposing economic hardship on the industry if there's no difference?
Do others agree around the table? I'll take head nodding. Dan McKiernan.
Yeah, Tony, I'm personally struggling with which state waters fisheries this might be impacting. And I'm wondering if the councils might be just the better parties to be weighing in on it. Because after hearing the presentation, I don't think there's any state waters fisheries that we're managing that would be affected by this.
Yep. I hear another person agreeing with Dan, but how about this? I'll let you guys stew on this overnight. Tomorrow we have a place for this on the agenda. If we come to a different conclusion, we'll work that out at the policy board meeting. Spencer, thank you very much for your presentation. We really appreciate you joining us. And we will do our best to start the Menhaden board meeting in 5 minutes if we can. So try not to go too far.